My book, The Art and Making of Fantasy Miniatures, is available now. Check out the link in the description to find out more. This is a review of The Making of Star Wars: Revenge of the Sith, which is one of my absolute all-time favorite making of books, which isn't particularly surprising given that it's written by J.W. Rinzler, who is, without any competition, the best author of film-related books. If you're familiar with any of Rinzler's other books, this one might seem a little less impressive at first glance, but that's more to do with the nature of the project. This book's format and page count follow that of most standard making of books, whereas Rinzler's later books are a bit more grand. But despite that, it's the content of the text that makes this book so incredible and just puts 99% of other making of books to shame. In fact, it's not just the quality of the content, but also the quantity. I feel like this must have twice the amount of text as your average making of book, despite having a similar page count, because it's impossible for any one book to cover an entire movie's production due to the fact that it can only have a couple of hundred pages, which is why I often get annoyed with books wasting space with worthless text, poor layout, giant images, and so on. But with this book, another reason I have such high admiration for it is that it crams so much content in here. In fact, in his foreword, the producer Rick McCallum actually says, "We've crammed into this book as much as we could," and that is very true. There is no wasted space. I mean, look at this. This is the copyright page at the start, which is almost always just the legal text and then blank space around it. But here they've actually used that otherwise blank space to squeeze in 3 other artworks and some storyboards. That's just awesome. Then throughout the book, most of the images are very modestly sized, almost no stills from the movie, so hooray. The amount of images and text is phenomenal, just how much they fit in without sacrificing one or the other, and to do all this sort of stuff shows such wonderful thought in trying to make the best book you possibly can for your reader. However, I don't expect everyone to share my enthusiasm for this book. There are completely legitimate and defensible reasons why some people might not like certain things about it, but I think that all comes down to personal preferences rather than more objective, critical, they have done XYZ wrong. Any displeasure anyone has will be more to do with the fact that it's quite a unique book, so I really want to give you a clear idea of why I personally find the book to be such a rewarding reading experience, but also balance that with the limitations the book has so you are aware of exactly what you're getting and can make a more informed decision if it sounds like something you'll enjoy or not. So the big limitation of this book is the same as every making of book ever made, and I've already mentioned it, that you can't cover everything satisfactorily in a few hundred pages. It's impossible. In fact, it's Rinzler himself who has made the best attempt of anyone to achieve such a thing with his making of books for the original trilogy, aka the best making of books ever made. But even so, it can never be the ultimate, complete behind-the-scenes source. There's always going to be more stuff you wish was covered or covered more deeply. Yet almost every single making of book that comes out makes the same futile attempt to cover too much, and just ends up being so broad and shallow that in trying to cover everything, they cover nothing satisfactorily, which makes them ultimately unfulfilling books. And so, if it's impossible to cover everything thoroughly in one book, what can you do? What is the alternative if you still want to make a great behind-the-scenes book? Well, you accept it and realize that the smarter approach is to instead craft a satisfying experience. And that's exactly what this book does and why it stands so high in my esteem. Whether or not it's an experience you'll personally approve of may vary, but that it does present a unique, well thought out experience that sets it apart is undeniable, and especially admirable for trying to depart from the typical lazy, lackluster, cookie cutter approach most authors use for art and making of books. And so the way this book's experience manifests is through great text and a unique, engaging structure. So the way the book's structured is presenting the text as a diary of this production. And so we've got dated entries starting with George Lucas's first meeting with the art department, which was before the script was written, and going all the way through to the end of shooting and a little bit into post-production. Now each of these diary entries records something that's happening that day, focusing on a particular event and or moment, and it's often presented in whole or in part in a fly-on-the-wall style, like you are there listening and watching as it's happening, and this is probably the most defining and memorable feature of this book. In fact, I'll just read you this bit from the introduction where Rinzler explains this approach. The point has been to write a book that gives readers the feeling that they were genuinely present in the art department on the sets at ILM and seeing things as they happened. Events, conversations, breakthroughs, and tensions have all been recorded as they occurred in real time, chronologically, with the same lack of future sight that existed at the time the events were recorded. See, now that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about when I say that a book should be created as an experience, and as an approach I just love. It's so much better than the contrived approach of most other making of books where everything is grouped by subject or department, and all you get are broad generalizations about what they do on the movie, whereas this book, presenting the chronological making of the movie, is so much more natural, and by also putting your reader in the room as it's happening makes for a much more interesting and engaging behind the scenes experience. Much like what makes the prequel art book so great, in this book there's a focus on evolution and exploration of things that didn't make it into the film, which I think is a much more interesting and truthful look at filmmaking, to not just portray it as if the journey from script to screen is one clear-cut straight line, which is the impression most books present. But with this book, you're following the journey of a movie as it's being made, oftentimes putting you directly in the room as it's happening, and the result is a true behind-the-scenes look that I found incredibly revealing into the process in a way I've never read anywhere else. And that's what I consider to be the great achievement and reward of this book, to the point that I can't believe that this isn't the more standard way of writing making of books, particularly because it's such an obvious and more natural way to present the making of a movie, and yet almost no books do that, instead falling back on the lazy, ineffectual standard approach. Though I suspect it could also be because most authors aren't given the same level of access and time that Rinzler was, but I don't really consider that to be a good excuse because, they should. Now, having said that, this is not the first book to use this approach, neither the production diary nor the eyewitness styles. In fact, it's not even the first Star Wars book to do this. The making of books from the 80s for Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi used this approach, but neither of those were visual books, and even Myth-Making, the making of book for Attack of the Clones, which I've previously reviewed and is also fantastic, that followed the movie chronologically, which is also another very effective approach, and that book also had these occasional pages called Notes from the Set, which were very much like the diary entries of this book. And then there are making of books for other movies that have done this sort of thing or played around with elements of it, like having the author describe their tour around the different departments. But to me, this Revenge of the Sith book is the best example, not only due to its commitment to the idea, but also because of how well done the actual text is, which is a disparagingly rare thing for me to say in a review. I just get so sick and tired of how many books are spoiled by subpar authors who are just too lazy or too clueless, whereas Jonathan Rinzler is the complete opposite. His books consistently show evidence that he gets what these books need to be, and overall just seems to have a really great sense of what his duty is to this book, his reader, and as a chronicler of a movie's history. However, because one can never have their cake and eat it too, the only way all this great stuff can be achieved is through sacrifices being made in other areas. So, like I said before, just because I responded really well to the experience this book offers doesn't mean you will. What each of us wants from a book can vary wildly, which is why I really want to stress the limitations of the book so you know exactly what you're getting and what you're not getting. And to do that, I think it's important to understand what's covered and how it's covered. So going back to my constant bemoaning of how most making of books spread themselves too thin and how it would be more interesting and rewarding if they just limited their focus more, well, this book does just that, thank God. Again, things like this are why I have so much high praise and respect for Rinzler, because the result is that this book has an identity due to its commitment to a clear direction. And so I would describe the focus of this book as kind of more about how the movie as a story is crafted, the pieces and processes that are needed as it evolves from a vague idea in Lucas's head to what we see on screen. So the first section is pre-production, and the focus is primarily on the art department with a secondary focus on the development of the story. So it's about creating these ideas of what the movie's going to be. The next section is for principal photography, and the focus is on the shooting, the actors and George Lucas capturing those ideas as footage. And then the final section is on shooting the pickups and editorial, so assembling those ideas as a film. And I just love this dedication to a focused concept. You see how the selected areas of focus relate to one another and have a follow-through that supports the overall direction. Again, creating a fulfilling experience for the reader. But this focus on those few areas comes at the expense of not a lot of coverage of other departments, costumes, props, miniatures, creatures and prosthetics, set construction, lighting, sound, so on. All of that stuff absolutely make occasional appearances. They are represented, but barely when compared to the main areas of focus. The representation of visual effects, however, is one area that lies somewhere in between. It gets more focused than the other stuff I just mentioned, but even then it mostly relates to getting shots finished for editorial rather than being especially technically or artistically revealing, which is a little surprising given that greater than 50% of the film is created digitally. Similarly, overall there's not a whole lot of focus on like actual craft or technical how such and such is achieved. So like for the actual shooting of the movie, which is the biggest single area of the book, it's mainly focused on what the actors and George are doing, with only occasional references to what anyone else is doing or contributing. Though thankfully, because this is Star Wars we're talking about, most behind the scenes subjects relating to these movies have their own dedicated books, which is awesome and how things should be. But I can still easily imagine many people not liking that so many other areas of how the film was made are neglected. In fact, I still felt that way, that slight twinge of disappointment. But then I would stop and remind myself of how unsatisfying most other making of books are when spreading themselves too thin trying to cover everything. And then I would realize that in terms of what's possible, or at least practical, Rinzler has made the wiser decision with this book. Staying focused and doing something really well is ultimately more rewarding than doing everything poorly. But it's still important that you be aware of this and not expecting the usual show and tell highlight reel that is other making of books. Also very important to understand is that when I say it's a diary, that doesn't mean it's a record of every second of every day, or even an overview of everything that happened that day. Instead, each entry usually just focuses on an event or moment happening that day, and in fact often it really is just a moment, capturing a very small sliver of time. And that's usually where the whole fly on the wall thing comes into play. What you would be seeing and hearing if you were actually there for those brief moments watching the movie come to life. I mean, it's really only recording maybe a few minutes for any given day, which doesn't sound like much at all, and it's not, but you know, again, it's only one book, so that's really the only option. Yet I still found what is presented, however fleeting, to be engaging and fascinating. Now, because just eavesdropping and observing what's happening obviously doesn't provide a lot of context, so in addition to that, Rinzler sets up any background or other information we need to know. Likewise, there are also the more normal talking head style explanations from the filmmakers directly to us, although I wouldn't say explanations are this book's strong suit. Like I mentioned before, there's not a whole lot of breaking down or explaining how certain things were achieved. One thing I think some people will love and others hate about this diary style is that in recording these filmmaking slice of life vignettes, there's often quite a lot of seemingly inconsequential fluff being related that isn't offering any actual interest or insight. So some people will say, yeah, it's a good record of the production, but who cares what date construction began for a particular set? I don't care who was in attendance at a certain meeting or drinking a cup of coffee. I want to read more about how and why certain things were achieved. In fact, I'd be lying if I didn't say that I'd wish the book had spent a little less of its word count on recording trivial details and instead gone a little deeper in its explorations and explanations. So I guess that's the most important thing to realize, that since this is a diary, it's recording the journey of this movie. The focus is more on what happened rather than how it was done. And yeah, sometimes the descriptions seem boring when the author's describing what someone is doing or working on, but without specifics or purpose or deeper explanation, it just becomes shallow fluff that eats up the word count and has no value to the reader. And so whether this book's approach is a better or worse system for delivering cold hard facts is debatable, but in terms of an experience, it's much better. Especially considering how one of my biggest frustrations with 90% of other art making of books is how often most of the text feels like an absolute waste of words and time anyway. So even on the rare occasions when I feel like this book does the same, at least it has the decency to be done in service to the experience of giving you a more realistic and immersive sense of being in the room. For example, a lot of the book's made up of recording conversations between people. Often these are the best parts to read, but other times the exchanges are just jokey banter or completely mundane, but even then I still enjoyed it, if for no other reason than usually we're not privy to the interactions filmmakers have amongst themselves behind closed doors. We usually only get to observe or experience them alone or together when they're talking to an audience, an interview or whatever. Whereas I found overhearing the more candid, everyday, down-to-earth aspects recorded in the book add an important sense of verisimilitude. And on top of that, I just love the openness of this book overall. Also, before where I was saying not every sentence in this book is hard-hitting behind-the-scenes facts, or in my constant referring to this as an experience, I really hope I'm not giving the impression that that's all this book is, or that it's not as informative. That couldn't be further from the truth. It's still absolutely bursting with information, facts, trivia, insight into the creation of this movie. As I mentioned, there will often be some stuff that you may not find particularly interesting, but compared to the production note drivel that is most other books, where in reviews I frequently say you have to wade through tons of boring crap to find good stuff, whereas that's not even close to being a concern for this book. I still don't think there are many making of books that can rival this one in terms of the quantity and quality of behind-the-scenes information. I just find there's a tricky balance in doing these reviews where I want to be as transparent about the book's limitations for the discriminating reader without unduly scaring other readers off. I should also point out that there's not an entry for every day this movie was being made. For pre- and post-production, there's an entry. It's not exact, but I'd say roughly one entry a week, which again feels like you're missing out on a ton of stuff if all you're getting is one little snippet of something that happened each week. But because this book's written by someone who knows what they're doing, the upswing of being more frugal with the pre- and post-production entries means that there's enough room to include an entry for every single day of shooting for principal photography. And I think that's such a good decision. That's the kind of thoroughness and focus that makes this book so worthy of distinction and applause among art and making of books. Another example being the way the art has been handled. So along with this book, Rensler also did the art book for Revenge of the Sith, and I could be wrong about this, but as far as I can tell, there are only a handful of pieces that are displayed in both books, meaning that at least 75% of the artworks in this book are not in the art book, which I just think is awesome and so rewarding not to just have space wasted reprinting stuff that's already in the art book. That may seem like such a simple and obvious thing, but the number of art and making of books that don't do that are completely uncoordinated, makes it so gratifying to see books handled by someone who actually uses their brain and gives a damn about making the best books possible for fans. Unfortunately, my singing of this book's praises has to end on a bit of a sour note once we get to the very, very end, where we come upon the only thing I really don't like about this book, the one major blemish. And that is the last section, which is about the final 7 months of post-production and accounts for 20% of the book, except it's not actually in the book. Instead, it was only released as a PDF online, and that really pisses me off. Now, the reason that this was done is because the book came out a month before the movie in order to promote it, and for that to happen, the book obviously had to be finalized and printed long before that, while the movie was still in post-production. And I just hate the mentality behind compromising the quality of a book just so it can be leveraged as a promotional tool. Yes, having the book come out at the same time as the movie or game or whatever will absolutely sell better, which is of course why they do it, but I just can't stand any endeavor where making money is deemed more important than making something good. And it's particularly disappointing in this case, where you have an amazing book that is clearly putting so much effort into being as awesome as it possibly can and thoughtful and rewarding to fans, only to suddenly end on a note that's the complete opposite of all that. Very disappointing that the book was compromised in this way, especially because the last chapter is just as fantastic as the rest of the book. It basically just continues the recording of the film's refinements in editorial and getting the visual effects shots delivered, and then also ADR and the scoring of the movie. The other reason I hate that they ended the book this way is because it also makes use of something else I completely detest: books that have any sort of online component, because those components are typically abandoned after a few years, of which this book is a perfect example. The website it tells you to access to read the final chapter no longer has it. but if you search for it online, you can find it on Rinzler's website. So I'm glad and unsurprised, given his diligence, that he's doing his best to support the work, since neither the publisher nor Lucasfilm give a shit. But even so, what happens for someone trying to read this book 20, 30 plus years from now? Is his website still going to be hosted? Are people going to have to hit up forums and things trying to find someone who has saved a copy? It's more that I'm disappointed that such a stupid deficiency is spoiling the book from a perfect score. But that significant disappointment aside, I otherwise can't stress how brilliant I think this book is. It truly is one of the best making of books ever written.